So let's talk about getting into Harvard Law. Getting into Harvard Law is not just about writing a great personal statement or having a passion for justice. It's a numbers game, meaning you've got to know your numbers if you want to get accepted. Here's what you're up against. The median LSAT score for Harvard Law is a 174. The median GPA is a 3.93. Let me pause there just for a second because I want this to sink in for you. That means half the students they admit scored above a 174 on the LSAT, and half of their admitted students had a GPA median of 393 or higher. So if you are below those numbers in either category, you've got to have a really strong reason for them to make an exception. And if you're below on both the LSAT and the GPA, you're in really tough territory. Back when I was looking to apply to law school, I had only a 3.3 GPA. Definitely not ideal. I made some mistakes early in college. I goofed off. I partied too much. I took some classes that did not play to my strengths. Didn't take things seriously enough. But I scored a 175 on the LSAT, making me a splitter applicant. Low GPA could compensate for it with a higher LSAT score. Now, back then, Harvard's numbers were not nearly as high as they are today. But if I were applying today with that same 3.3 GPA, I would not be aiming for a 174. I'd be aiming for a 177 or higher, no question. Because law schools, especially top law schools, care a lot about their numbers. They report their LSAT and GPA to the American Bar Association. US News pulls those numbers from the American Bar Association for inclusion in the ever important US News Law School rankings. And law schools cannot fudge those numbers. If they accept too many students with low GPAs or low LSAT scores, their medians are going to go down. And that means their standing in the rankings goes down, which means they're getting fewer applicants next year, less prestige, less scholarship money, less donations. It's a whole domino effect. That's why they protect those numbers like gold. So what does that mean for you? It means that your LSAT score is the single biggest lever you can pull in this entire process. And you can't go back in time and fix your GPA. You can't redo sophomore year. You can't magically add 0.5 to your GPA on your transcript. But you can and should improve your LSAT score. And it starts right now. If you're sitting at a 161 and your GPA is a 3.4, then every extra point on your LSAT makes you exponentially more competitive. If you can go from 161 to 165, from 165 to 170, from 170 to 175, these aren't just arbitrary jumps. They are category shifts in how your application is going to be viewed. And yeah, I know, it's just a test. It's just a few hours, one day, 2.5 hours, but it weighs more heavily than your entire undergraduate GPA combined. It can override 4 years of a subpar GPA. And that one number, your LSAT score, could make you eligible for law schools and for scholarships that were totally out of reach before. Now, the first step to getting there isn't flashy, it's not exciting, but it is the foundation for everything else. You've got to get crystal clear on what numbers you need to be competitive. I want you to get brutally honest about where you are right now and make the decision today to take your LSAT prep seriously. That's where you get leverage. And that's what gives you a shot at schools like Harvard, Yale, and Stanford, even if your GPA is not perfect. Because when they see a low GPA, but a sky-high LSAT score, they see a splitter. And they love splitters. You're going to help them boost their LSAT median, and you make their stats look better. So if you're a strong LSAT candidate, even with a low GPA, you are still an asset. And that is the mindset I want you to have going into this process. Now, let's talk about one of the biggest time wasters I see from law school applicants. It's doing nice sounding things that don't actually help your application. And I get it. These sorts of things can feel productive and they feel strategic, but in reality, you're probably just procrastinating from doing the hard work when it comes to the LSAT. I see people retaking undergrad classes years after they already graduated because they want to raise their GPA, but it only does it by a minuscule amount. I'm talking a tenth of a point. You've got people polishing their resumes for the 10th time, changing the font, changing the layout, the bullet points, as if it's going to move them off the wait list. You've got people spending hours researching internships, fellowships, paralegal jobs, thinking that if maybe they add just one more line of experience, it's going to somehow tip the scales. Let me be blunt. None of that is going to make up for a weak LSAT score. I had a student ask me the other day, no joke, Steve, should I go back and retake some of my college classes to boost my GPA? And I said, let's do the math. If you took 40 classes in undergrad and you retake one or two of those, even if you ace them, that's what? 2 out of 40, 2.5%, maybe 5% if you double that. That's not going to move the needle. That's assuming that your school even allows grade replacement, which many of them do not. So if you're looking at months of effort, stress, tuition costs, and potentially no meaningful improvement to your overall GPA, maybe you should focus on the LSAT instead. If you put that same time and energy there, let's say you're sitting at a 163, you spend 3 focused months improving your score to a 173, 10 more points. That kind of score jump puts schools like NYU, Penn, even Harvard back on the table. That could be the difference between getting 0 in scholarships or getting a full ride. And so if you're choosing between spending several hours a week studying for the LSAT versus taking night classes to raise your GPA by a sliver, it's not even close. Same goes for this other idea I hear a lot. Should I get a job as a paralegal to boost my application? Now, I want to be careful here. No offense to the many, many paralegals out there watching this right now. There is nothing wrong with being a paralegal. I was once a paralegal intern myself. I get it. And if you're already doing that work, that's great. You can certainly speak meaningfully about it in your application. But if you're thinking about quitting your job or delaying your LSAT prep just to get a law adjacent title on your resume, you're probably wasting your time. Here's why. Being a paralegal is one of the most common pre-law jobs. It's not special, it's not unique, it's not rare. Admissions sees paralegals all the time. Of course, it's not going to hurt you, but it's also not going to help you enough to justify sacrificing your LSAT prep hours, especially if that paralegal job eats up your nights with overtime and 0 flexibility. If that job is draining you, if you're working till 1 a.m. or 2 a.m. on someone else's deadline, overtime on a case, then you're still trying to squeeze in LSAT prep the next day, you're setting yourself up to underperform on the one piece of your application that actually gives you leverage. And here's the thing that nobody talks about. A high LSAT score doesn't just make you a stronger applicant. It also gives you options. It gives you leverage in negotiations. It puts scholarship money back on the table, and it makes you a more desirable applicant, even if the other parts of your application are weaker. So I want you to stop optimizing the wrong things. This is not the time to try to become the most interesting resume in the pile. You don't want to chase those gold stars in the form of job titles, volunteer hours, or tweaking your GPA. You got to double down on what works. And that means asking yourself every week, every day, is what I'm doing right now helping me increase my LSAT score? If the answer is no, cut it out or at least deprioritize it. There's going to be plenty of time to polish your personal statement, your resume, and your narrative overall once you have the score that gets you past the first round. But until then, I want you to focus on the one number that can make or break your application. That is the only thing that matters right now. And of course, it is your LSAT score. Now, people will talk about holistic review. It's a wonderful narrative for marketing brochures. And of course, they will look at your application essays. But at every top 14 school, and in fact, every top 50 school, the first pass is almost entirely driven by 2 data points: the highest LSAT score on your record and your cumulative undergraduate GPA because of the rankings. Every fall, law schools file an ABA 509 report. They are required to do so. And those numbers go straight to US News for inclusion in the rankings. And those rankings drive everything from applicant volume to alumni donations. So admissions offices build a simple index formula, a weighted blend of your LSAT with your GPA. And virtually every single law school weighs your LSAT score more heavily. And if that index score for you, if your unique combination of LSAT plus GPA clears a preset line or a benchmark, you are an auto admit and you're probably getting in. If you miss by too much, you become an auto deny, or maybe you get waitlisted. Only those gray zone files get a deep read right away. In other words, a stellar essay will not save you if your LSAT's a 155, but the school's median, like Harvard's, is a 174. Just is not going to cut it. You got to think of the medians like a scoreboard. Every admit above the LSAT median lets the school take one other admit below the GPA median, and it still lets them keep their overall numbers intact. But admits who are below both medians are going to harm them, which means they've got to offset somewhere else. And they just hate doing that. They don't want to have to do it. That's why a strong LSAT applicant but low GPA applicant is called a splitter. You could still be useful to them because you raise the LSAT column. And they love that. And law schools will deliberately recruit splitters on purpose, especially if you bring something else they value, like work experience, diversity, or a STEM background that lowers their 1L curve. But they're only going to do it if you are above on the LSAT. So what you want to do right now, you want to look up the ABA 509 reports for every school you're targeting. It's a free PDF. Just Google Harvard Law 509 or Yale Law 509 and so on, and you'll be able to see their GPA median, their LSAT median, and you can compare those against your numbers. Then, if you're not where you want to be, if your LSAT's coming up, you consider postponing or retaking down the line. If your LSAT's approaching in just a few weeks and you're not feeling ready, you could take it again 2 months, 3 months from now and still apply to law school this cycle. It's not too late. And of course, if your GPA is below medians, you can write a GPA addendum, one concise paragraph, but it's not going to compensate for the low numbers. The best course of action is just devote that effort to getting a higher LSAT. Now, when people start studying for the LSAT, they might buy a couple prep books, maybe take a free diagnostic test or scan it through Reddit threads, and they highlight a lot, watch a few YouTube videos, but their scores flatline because they don't have a real plan. Consuming content, even YouTube videos like this one, is not enough. I want to walk you through a system I've developed called the laser approach to LSAT prep. It's the framework I personally used to go from a 152 to a 175, and it's worked for thousands of my students over the past 20 years. It goes in 5 stages, and each one builds on the last. LASER is an acronym standing for Learning, Accuracy, Sections, Exams, and Review. And we use this framework to build personal study plans for our students at LSAT Unplugged. And by the way, if you would like my help helping you craft a personal plan of attack, you can book a free LSAT tutoring lesson with me personally at unpluggedprep.com/start. Link below this video on YouTube, link in my bio on Instagram, or take a photo of the QR code that used to be in the corner but no longer is. Now let's talk about the learning phase of prep. Learning is where you build your foundation. I want you to forget timing, forget tricks. Right now, you've just got to understand the structure of the test. I want you to start off with logical reasoning because it's now 2/3 of the LSAT. You've got to know how arguments work. You've got to recognize the different question types, not just the names of the types, but actually the logic behind each one. The most important types to master first are necessary assumption, inference, and flaw, because those are the most common types of questions in logical reasoning. You want to nail those, then switch gears and focus on the others. And this stage can feel slow. You're going to want to rush. You're going to want to do timed work, timed sections, timed exams, but you've got to focus on building the foundation first, because if you skip this phase, everything else falls apart. The LSAT is a test of pattern recognition. and you can't see the patterns if you don't understand the structure. So I want you to take your time and engage in clear, bite-sized lessons. I don't want you to use those 500-page LSAT prep textbooks that read like a philosophy seminar. What you want is targeted, concise explanations followed by examples. The second phase of the laser approach is A for accuracy. This is where you drill questions by type, not randomly. You don't just open up a practice test and start from question number 1. You want to say to yourself, today, I'm going to do 10 necessary assumption questions and figure out exactly how they work. And the key is that you don't want to rush through them. You are not trying to get through more questions. You're trying to get better at your thought process. So you want to look at the right answer and ask yourself, what made this correct logically? You want to look at the wrong answers and ask, what trap were they trying to get me to fall into here? And if you guessed correctly, I want you to still review it, because a lucky guess doesn't teach you anything. That is where the real improvement starts. You're not just answering LSAT questions here, you're training your brain to think like a test writer. Now we've got S for sections, where you start introducing some time pressure. Start with full 35-minute sections of both logical reasoning and reading comp. This is where you're training pacing. And a lot of students mess this up. They either go way too slow and they never finish, or they try to go too fast and their accuracy tanks as a result. So here is a simple rule of thumb for logical reasoning. I want you to try to finish questions 1 through 10 in only 10 minutes, because those questions are generally easier. You want to build up a time bank earlier that you can then apply to the tougher questions later in this section. Also, don't be afraid to skip questions. If something is taking too long, flag it, skip it, move on, because you can always come back later. But if you get stuck for 3 minutes on a single question, that might cause you to never even see a couple of other questions later. Time management is a skill, it's a habit, and you can build it by practicing just like this. Now, the next phase is E for exams and endurance, where you're doing full-length timed exams, 4 sections, back-to-back, no distractions, only a 10-minute break between sections 2 and 3. And the point here is not just to get a score, it's to build up your test day stamina. Most students, their brains are fried by section 4, and their focus drops, and their scores nosedive even if they knew the material. So the E for exams and endurance phase fixes that. You're training your brain and your body to perform consistently so test day feels like just another run through. And I don't want you to over-index on just one test and panic if the score is not what you hoped. You've got to do a series of tests with clear tracking, progress, and post-game analysis. Which leads us to the most important step, too often neglected, R for review. This is where the real learning happens. Most people will just take a test, check their scores, and move on. That is a huge mistake. Review is not only about what you got right, it's about why you got things wrong. Now, at LSAT Unplugged, we teach a process called the Socratic review method. And it works like this. For every question you miss, I want you to ask, where did I go wrong? Was it the stimulus, the question stem, the choices? You also want to ask, what was the trap? Did you misread something? Did you miss a conditional? Did you fall for a false comparison? And finally, what is the fix? Is it a logic issue, a timing issue, a reading issue? The reason we ask these questions is because if you can pinpoint the root cause, then the next time you see a similar pattern, you'll spot it instantly. That's how the real growth happens. But like I said, the LSAT is a test of pattern recognition. And the more clearly you can see the patterns, the more deliberately you train, the more predictable the test becomes. So the 5 phases again: learning, accuracy, sections, exams, and review. That is your roadmap. You're not guessing, you're not cramming, you're not just hoping this sticks. This is a structured system designed to build your understanding, sharpen your accuracy, and simulate test day, and all the while, systematically eliminate your mistakes. If you want to go from 160 to 170 or 170 to 175, this is how you do it step by step. Now let's talk about the part of LSAT prep that almost nobody teaches. It's about your timeline and your calendar. because it doesn't matter how good your study plan is if it doesn't line up with your actual life. And most students, to be frank, screw this up. They prep based on how they feel, not based on what they need. They'll take a cold diagnostic, get a 152, and immediately sign up for the next available test date because they feel motivated. They'll say things like, I just want to get it over with, or I'll be fine, I've got 2 months. And I get it. The pressure makes it feel real, but none of those are strategic reasons to pick a target test date. It's only an emotional decision. Now, let me be blunt. If you schedule the LSAT before you're ready, just to lock yourself in, you're setting yourself up for burnout, wasted money, and possibly multiple retakes. So, the better way to approach this is to start with the end in mind. You want to ask yourself, when do I want to apply? What LSAT score do I realistically need for the schools I'm targeting? And how many points do I need to improve between now and then? From there, you reverse engineer your timeline. Let's say you want to apply relatively early, like in November or January. And let's say you're starting at a 160, but your target score is a 173. That is a 13-point gap. For most students, that's going to take at least 2 to 3 months of focused, structured prep at a minimum. And if you're working full time, it might even take a little bit longer. So you don't just say, I'm going to take the November LSAT because everybody else is. You say, I'm going to use the next few months to prep. I'll take my first LSAT in January with February as a backup if I need it. That is a real plan based on data, not artificial pressure. Now, once you know your actual timeline, you map it against your actual commitments. For example, are you taking classes this semester? Do you have a full-time job that peaks in the fall? Do you have a wedding or a family trip planned during your study time? You got to build your plan around all of that. Too many people try to pretend their lives don't even exist while they're studying. And as a result, they burn out in 4 to 6 weeks and they wonder why their score plateaued. Instead, I want you to be honest. If you've only got 12 hours a week to study, that's totally fine. But then don't pretend you're going to improve 15 points in just 6 weeks. You've got to either adjust your test date or adjust your expectations and protect your peak study weeks. Treat the LSAT like finals. No big life changes, no social distractions, no major new commitments. It's not forever, but it's a short-term sprint that requires real focus. Now, let me say something that might surprise you. It's better to apply a bit later with a higher score than to rush and apply early with a mediocre score. A 162 in November is not nearly as good as a 173 in January. Every single time, applying later with a higher score beats earlier with a lower score. And most schools don't close their applications until February or March. They might start reviewing earlier, but they're still admitting stronger candidates several months later. So stop treating November like it's your last chance. You get 3 attempts per testing year and 7 for life. And schools only care about your highest score on record. So if your scores aren't where you want them to be, just push the test back and use that extra time to close the gap between where you are and where you want to be. If you withdraw, law schools will never even know that you were registered for that given test. Now, I want you to get out of the emotions and start tracking your progress week to week. You could even build a score tracker using Google Sheets, Google Docs, a physical notebook, doesn't matter. Log every single timed section you complete, as well as, of course, every full exam. And you can watch the trends in your accuracy, not just your raw score. Because that way, you can see if you're getting 20 questions wrong in logical reasoning, but only 3 wrong in reading comp, you're going to know where to focus. That lets you study smarter, not just harder. And if you see your score plateauing for 3 weeks straight, that is your cue to change something. Maybe you got to do more review, maybe different drills, maybe get some outside LSAT coaching, whatever. Don't keep doing the same thing and hoping it magically starts working. Now, here's what nobody tells you. You cannot cram for this exam. If your LSAT is on a Saturday, your last full-length practice test should be no later than at least 3 days prior. Ideally, in the final week, you're focused on light drills, gentle review, and you're going to bed early. You want to walk into test day feeling calm, sharp, and ready to crush it. You don't want your brain to be fried. Think of it like training for a marathon. The work actually happens several months before in the lead up. The final week, you're just staying loose and focused. Now, let's zoom out for a second. If you've made it this far, you already know getting into Harvard Law or any T14 law school is not only about being smart. It's about understanding the game that you're playing and then playing it better than anybody else. Now, I'm not saying you ought to be perfect. You don't need a 4.0 GPA. You don't need a fancy undergrad degree or to have a personal connection to the admissions committee. You just got to know what schools care about, what metrics actually drive your chances, and how to build your entire application process around what actually works. Because you could waste months on the wrong things. Your resume, your personal statement, an internship, retaking old college classes. But you could still get rejected because your LSAT score wasn't high enough. But alternatively, you could spend just a couple of focused months improving your LSAT by 10 points or more, and then get into a T14 law school. That is the power of leverage. And that's why I keep coming back to this one idea. The LSAT is the highest ROI activity in your entire law school application. If you've got a low GPA, your LSAT gives you a second chance. If you've got limited work experience, the LSAT becomes the great equalizer. And if you want scholarships, the LSAT is your currency. I'm not saying it's easy. It takes real work, but it's also the biggest part of your application that you still control. So whether you want to go to Harvard, Yale, Stanford, Columbia, Cornell, NYU, Michigan, and so on, or even if you want a full ride at a local regional law school, the playbook doesn't change. Know your numbers, cut the fluff, and know how admissions really works. And if you want my help, you can book a free LSAT tutoring lesson with me personally at unpluggedprep.com/start. Link is below this video on YouTube or in my bio on Instagram. Now, we've got a question here in the chat from Kyle asking, hey, Steve, does accuracy in the laser approach include drilling the very hardest questions before moving on? Great question, Kyle. So drilling the hardest questions, I don't recommend necessarily a drill focused specifically on the hardest questions. Usually when I talk about drilling, I'm talking about drilling by question stem type, like strengthen, weaken, flaw, necessary assumption, sufficient assumption, and so on. But if you want to drill hard questions, if you're already getting the easy ones right, then of course, by all means, be my guest. There's a really easy way to drill questions by type, and I'll tell you what it is. Because logical reasoning questions are built in a general order of difficulty, meaning they get harder as the section goes on, if you are already consistently getting the easiest questions right, what you could do as an exercise is simply do the second half of a logical reasoning section, meaning that you take questions, say 15 through 26, and you do only those. You don't bother doing 1 to 14 because you're already probably going to get those right anyway. Of course, you can't do this timed, but if you already know that, let's say you're in the 165 range, want to be in the 170 to 175 range, the work is to be done on the hardest question specifically. So if you're in a position where you don't really have time to do a full timed section, but you want to do just hard questions, then yeah, do questions 15 through 25 or 26 or so. Excellent question. I'll stay on for a bit longer and take some more questions. If anything else comes up here, happy to address as many of these as I can. Feel free to drop them in the chat on YouTube or on Instagram. Got another question here from Kyle. Kyle writes, you said in the worst case scenario, you could take it in February, but wouldn't that be too late for the upcoming cycle? No, it wouldn't be too late. I mean, I'm thinking you're talking about the current cycle, right? So if you are looking to apply to law school in fall 2025 to start law school in fall 2026, the February LSAT is not too late. Of course, all else being equal, better to apply earlier than later. But the thing is that all else is rarely equal, because if giving yourself another 3 months from the November LSAT or another additional month beyond January into February, if that additional time could get you a higher score, then it's well worth applying a little bit later to boost up your LSAT another 3 points, 5 points, 10 points or more. That could be worth tens of thousands of dollars in scholarship money. If it gets you into a better law school, even better, right? So the February LSAT is not too late. There is still scholarship money available. There's a lot of mythology out there around the idea of the February LSAT being too late, but it is not. It is totally fine. You'll see this in the data. The law schools have no incentive to care about when you apply because they are not evaluated based on that metric. They are evaluated based on the highest LSAT score of the matriculating students because that's what goes to the ABA, which in turn is where US News pulls that data from for inclusion in the ever important US News Law School rankings. And of course, if you are applying in fall 2026 to start law school in fall 2027, the February LSAT is actually early because you could take it in February. You've then got April or June as a backup, and you're applying in the fall right when applications open. So excellent question, Kyle. Thank you for that. Feel free to drop more in the chat. And by the way, if you want to talk through your situation more personally, you can book that free LSAT tutoring lesson with me personally at unpluggedprep.com/start. Link below this video on YouTube or in my bio on Instagram. Got a question about logical reasoning being random and inconsistent. How do I actually get good at logical reasoning fast? And the good news is that logical reasoning is 2/3 of the test, right? So any gains that you make in your understanding of logical reasoning will be doubled across the two sections, making it the biggest bang for your buck. Now, every logical reasoning question is basically the same story, right? You got an argument, you've got a flaw, some sort of gap or assumption, and your job is to analyze it using the task in the question stem. So you want to read for conclusion, evidence, and the bridge to connect them. That bridge is the assumption between the two parts, and most questions will poke at the assumption, they'll fix it, or they will simply describe it. And like I said earlier, there are only 3 big questions in logical reasoning to focus on to start with: necessary assumption, inference, and flaw. For necessary assumption, you are looking for which bridge needs to be the case in order for the argument to work. For a flaw question, your job is to identify or name the bad or flawed reasoning. And for inference questions, you want to know what is required by the facts in the stimulus. Now, your job to start with is to tag the task from the question stem first. For example, you want to note, is it necessary assumption? Is it strengthen? Is it inference? Is it flaw? Then you want to note the conclusion, which is sometimes indicated by keywords like therefore, thus, so, or hence. You want to note the evidence, which is sometimes indicated by because or since. That is your premises or your data. Then you want to name the flaw or the assumption in plain English. For example, they assumed X causes Y, or they treated correlation like causation, or they jumped from an unrepresentative sample to all people. Then your job is to predict or prephrase the answer. For example, the argument's method of reasoning is to strengthen by ruling out an alternate cause. For necessary assumption questions, you want something that needs to be the case, or if not, the argument collapses. This is why the negation test works. The correct choice when negated destroys the argument. For a sufficient assumption question, you want to note what, if true, would guarantee the conclusion, leaving no ambiguity at all. Now, logical reasoning, you don't need to do all the questions in order. It's about getting as many points as possible per minute of time invested. As a general rule of thumb, I recommend knocking out the first 10 questions in roughly 10 minutes, building up a time bank you can then apply to the tougher questions later in the section that truly need it. You also want to set a cap of about 90 seconds per question on any single question in your first pass. Anything that's going to take longer, you flag it, you skip it, and you come back to it later. Now, most students will try to get it now in the moment and then get stuck as a result. If you have trouble with a question, you flag it, you skip it, you come back later. Then later, after the fact, during your review, you want to ask yourself, what did I think the conclusion was? Where specifically did my reasoning go wrong? Which word or phrase tricked me? And what's my new rule to prevent this exact same mistake in the future? Now, if you've got 10 days, a logical reasoning sprint that you want to engage in leading up to your next LSAT, I want you to spend 15 minutes negating, 35 minutes doing one timed logical reasoning section, and another 20-30 minutes of deep review using the Socratic review method, specifically for the questions that gave you trouble. So again, 15 minutes negating, 35 minutes doing a timed section, and 20 to 30 minutes doing a deep review. This is a daily study plan to focus on leveling up in logical reasoning specifically, since it is 2/3 of the LSAT, and negation is the technique to use for necessary assumption questions, which are one of the most common types of logical reasoning questions. Now, what does it mean to be good at logical reasoning? It's not that you suddenly understand everything. It's that you can tag the question stem type in 2 seconds or less. You can mark the conclusion and the evidence in only 10 to 15 seconds, and you can pre-phrase or name the flaw in plain English. Then, when you are evaluating the choices, you can knock out 3 of them fast because you know right away they don't do the job, and you can choose between the 2 remaining choices or the contenders by rechecking the job, meaning the task or the job to be done. And this is a consequence or result of putting in the reps. Logical reasoning, like the LSAT as a whole, is a test of pattern recognition, meaning you want to focus on noting the patterns in the heavy hitter, high leverage question types. Again, they are necessary assumption, inference, and flaw. If you do this for just the next 2 weeks, you will see your logical reasoning performance skyrocket. And that, my friends, is how you get the highest possible score increase in logical reasoning in the limited time remaining until your test. Now, I've got a question here from Fulani Queen saying, I watched your video on reading comp strategies and it was helpful. Awesome. What techniques do you have for focus and improving with time? So focus, Fulani Queen, is a muscle, and you build up that muscle by engaging in deep focused study rather than getting easily distracted by, say, social media, your phone, the internet at large. You do deep work. And so that means that you sit for a dedicated period of time, say 35 minutes for a single section or 2.5 hours for a full exam. You shut out all distractions and you focus only on the task at hand. You do only the boring work because it works, it's effective. And you try meditating. If you can't do 35 minutes, you can't do an hour, you can't do 2.5 hours, just sit for literally 10 seconds, close your eyes, and focus on your breath. Inhale and exhale. You do that for just 10 seconds, then 30 seconds, then a minute, then 5 minutes. You shut out all distractions and you focus on the breath. Every time your mind wanders, you come back to the breath. And it's okay if your mind wanders. What is key is that you notice when your mind is wandering. The moment that you notice is the moment that you bring it back, and that's how you build the muscle. And that way, when your mind wanders on test day or when you spiral, you get anxiety or panic because you're not getting a question, you notice that you're spiraling and you come back to the task at hand. That's why the breathing exercise works. I don't care if you notice that you're breathing or not, but you're building that muscle that then applies in a totally different area, like logical reasoning, the single task at hand, the single argument that you are analyzing. So that's how you build it up. And you do just 5 minutes a day, ideally, for the next 3 weeks or the next 3 months. And that's how you build it up. And then you speed up overall because you recognize the patterns of the test. Like I said so many times, the LSAT is a test of pattern recognition, meaning that the topic is only surface level. The structure or the skeleton is really what is at the core. And the reason that I can do LSAT questions faster than many other people is because I have become more acquainted with the common formats, the patterns, the skeletons, the structures. And so when I see a new logical reasoning or reading comp passage, I can easily and automatically relate it back to the many, many, many other questions of that type that I've seen in the past. And as a result, I'm not thinking through the logic of that question for the first time on test day. I've seen it before, and I can strip away the window dressing of the topic to get down to the underlying core structure of that argument or passage. And so in short, it's a question and a focus of just putting in the reps to increase your exposure, to deepen your familiarity. So I hope you find that helpful, Fulani Queen. I hope you found this entire live stream helpful. And if you want to talk through this more, your LSAT study plan, whenever you're taking the LSAT, whether it's November, January, February, April, or beyond, I'd be happy to help you out and talk through your situation personally in more depth. You can book a free LSAT tutoring lesson with me personally at unpluggedprep.com/start. Link below the video on YouTube or in my bio on Instagram. It's linked in the comments in the chat here as well. And by the way, If you liked this live stream, I'm doing a several-hour all-day live stream this Friday, starting at 8:30 a.m. Eastern Time here on the YouTube channel, because it is LSAT score release day, but I'll be focusing on those taking the LSAT going forward in November, January, February, and beyond. I'll be doing open Q&A with as many students as I possibly can. It'll be here on the channel, again, this Friday, 8:30 a.m. Eastern Time, all day LSAT YouTube and Instagram live stream. Check it out. Tune in for it. I'll be happy to help you out. Thanks for the great questions, folks. In the meantime, I wish you all the best and take care.